I just want to talk through a few aspects about the funding of public transport. So the first point I want to make is a rather strange sounding, kind of wordy semantic point. And that is that funding and finance are not the same thing. Okay, so funding is the money. It's where the money comes from. Finance is the way in which the money comes in. So you'll often hear the government or employers or whatever use a phrase like private finance, the private finance initiative, that kind of thing. And what they're trying to have you believe is that private sector, private companies are giving money to TfL. Now, private companies don't do that. They're not philanthropists, they're not charities. They only put money into things if they're going to get more money back out. Okay. So in that case, in a private finance situation, the finance might be coming from the private sector, but ultimately the money isn't. Okay. So there are only two major and one minor sources from where the money ultimately comes from, regardless of how it gets to public transport. Okay. So the very minor source of income is little things like advertising revenue, renting out retail space on stations of that kind of thing. Other than that, and that's, less than 5% of the income of pretty much any public transport provider. Other than that, funding only comes from two sources. One, fares revenue, and two, government grants. Okay, be that local, regional, or national government. And if you've had a look at the comparisons between how London Underground is funded and how other similar systems around the world are funded, you'll find a massive difference. That London Underground is expected to rely much more on fares revenue and much less on government grants than other systems around the world. So that'll already give you an idea to start off as to why we're in the financial difficulties we are in, even before the COVID pandemic came along. So there's an argument to be had about what should the balance be between what passengers pay in fares and what the government pays in. And that comes down to an argument about who benefits from public transport. Because the rationale behind saying that fares must pay for virtually everything is that public transport is a service to its passengers and only to its passengers. But it seems to me that when someone travels to work on public transport, it's not just them, or indeed even mainly them, that's benefiting. It's their employer, because their employer is getting their worker delivered to work and then taken home again by public transport. Similarly, if you get a tube train from out in the sticks to Oxford Street to do your Christmas shopping and then take it home again on the tube, is that a benefit to you? Well, maybe it is partly, but it's also a big benefit to those shops on Oxford Street, because public transport is delivering their clients, their shoppers to them, their customers, and helping them to make their profits. So that is the basis of the argument that we'd say public transport systems should get a large amount of public funding, because the economy more generally benefits from the provision of public transport, not just the individual people who travel on it. Landlords and developers, for instance, benefit from public transport because they can charge more when they sell a house or rent out a flat, if it is near a tube station or if it's near a train station, if it's well served by public transport. So they benefit from it as well. So what the government could do, and I would argue should do, is bring in money from them to help fund public transport through, for example, corporation tax, which has been massively cut over the last couple of decades, through maybe land value tax, through France has a thing called a payroll tax. It's a special transport tax that regional authorities levy on employers, where employers pay a certain proportion of their wages bill in a transport tax to help fund the local transport. So in Paris, for instance, that figure is set at 2%. So every company that employs, I think, more than 100 people has to pay a tax of 2% of their wages bill, and that all gets given to the RATP, which is the body that runs the Paris Metro. Okay, so the Paris Metro starts off with a decent level of funding before it even has to calculate, well, how much should we charge in fares, etc. Where else can we get any money? And the reason it's funded like that in France is a recognition that employers benefit from public transport, not just the individual passengers who travel on it. The other issue around the private sector and public transport is probably the biggest problem public transport has financially is lack of money coming in, but there's also a problem with money leaking out. And wherever TfL contracts out any of its services, like, for example, cleaning or catering or some engineering functions, etc., to a private company, then that's public money that goes out of the system, and it goes out of the system into the coffers of the private companies, some of which are big multinationals and many of which have extremely large remuneration packages for their big cheeses. So it's my view that we need to see public transport in a wider social context. It's not just a commodity that you sell to people. Here's a journey, buy it. It has a big impact on the wider economy, but it also has a big impact on things like health, public health, and like the environment. So if you can imagine if London Underground shut down, okay, completely, and the DLR shut down and London Overground shut down, then even now, let alone in normal times, very soon the air quality in London would get much, much worse. So respiratory illnesses would get much, much worse. Pollution would get worse. Health outcomes, environmental outcomes, etc., would all be much, much worse. So public transport exists in that context. We need to insist that it's seen as part of the social and economic infrastructure of London and the surrounding areas, indeed of the whole country, rather than just being something you might go and buy, and like a tube journey being something you might go and buy in a shop. If you look through the history of London Underground, so it's over 150 years old now. I'm not going to talk you through the whole history, don't worry. But if you do, it was set up first by private companies just over 150 years ago. Eventually it was brought into the public sector in 1934, but there have been various changes in the way it's been governed and financed over all that time. And reading through that history, I came to the conclusion that there are 5 factors that determine how well London Underground does as a public transport provider at any one time. Okay, and those 5 factors are: firstly, whether it's publicly owned or privately owned. It does better when it's publicly owned. Secondly, how well it's funded. Okay, so it does a lot better when it's getting extra money for the government. That's when it's able to expand, improve, upgrade itself, become safer, etc. Thirdly, how integrated it is, whether it functions as a single body or whether lots of bits are fragmented out all over the place. That one. Yeah. Sometimes it's been run by a national body and sometimes by a London body. It does better when it's run by a London body. It makes it more directly accountable to the people in and around London. And fifthly, the ethos under which it's allowed to operate. Successive governments have tried to make it function more like a business. So it was called London Underground until the 1984 Transport Act, when the Tories changed its name, and that's when it became known as London Underground Limited, because they said even though it's in the public sector, we're going to demand it acts like a private company. If it's allowed to function under an ethos of public service rather than as a private business, then it does a lot better. So those are the main points I want to make. Basically, I would advocate that we, as a union, perhaps more assertively than we already do, make the case for public transport as a public service, not simply as a commodity in the marketplace. And that therefore, instead of relying on so heavily on fares income, disproportionately more so than any other similar network in the whole world, that it should have government funding, it should have public funding in the interests of everyone.